The Eastern European plains trembled under the roar of engines. It was a crisp morning in 1985, and the Soviet 3rd Guards Tank Division was preparing for a large-scale live-fire exercise near the borders of West Germany. Rows of T-72s, the pride of the Red Army, gleamed under the low winter sun. Each tank crew had trained relentlessly for years, their drills honed to perfection. They were elite, hand-picked soldiers accustomed to domination on the battlefield. The T-72 was feared for its speed, firepower, and ability to absorb punishment that would have shattered older designs. They had faced countless simulations, and in every exercise, the T-72 had emerged victorious against NATO's older tank models. Confidence ran high. Victory was assumed. But this exercise was different. Intelligence reports had whispered of a new American tank, the M1 Abrams, being deployed in NATO exercises. Soviet command was skeptical. Tanks were tanks. Armor was armor. The T-72, with its 125mm smoothbore cannon and advanced APFSDS rounds, could pierce nearly any NATO tank at combat ranges. How could a single American tank change decades of armored warfare doctrine? The M1 Abrams rolled onto the training grounds with an almost otherworldly presence. Its angular hull, coated in layers of Chobham composite armor, reflected sunlight like a mirror. Its massive 120mm smoothbore cannon pointed forward, a silent promise of destruction. At first glance, it looked cumbersome, but those who had observed its trials knew the truth. Under that armor and steel frame was a machine built for speed, precision, and invincibility. Soviet tank crews, briefed only with intelligence dossiers, felt a thrill of anticipation. The brass ordered the assault. The T-72s would advance in full formation, their crews ready to unleash the deadliest ammunition in their arsenal. Every round fired in this exercise was designed to obliterate. Every maneuver was honed to capitalize on the T-72's superior agility. This was not just training, this was a statement of Soviet armored supremacy. The first salvo of shells screamed through the crisp air. APFSDS rounds, designed to penetrate armor with hypervelocity tungsten cores, slammed into the M1's hull. Crew members inside the Abrams felt the shockwave, but nothing, not a dent, not a spark, not a crack, marred the armor. The Soviet crews expected destruction within moments, yet the M1 remained steadfast, unmoved as if the bullets bounced off invisible shields. Panic and disbelief rippled through the Soviet ranks. Tankers who had dominated every NATO exercise suddenly froze. Some continued to fire, almost automatically, their training overriding reason. Others lowered their sights, staring at the gleaming American tank as if it were a ghost. No simulation had prepared them for this. Their most advanced weapons, the ones they trusted with their lives, had failed. The M1 Abrams, a singular machine of American ingenuity, had survived their best shots with ease. Across the battlefield, the Abrams commander, a seasoned veteran, remained calm. The crew had trained extensively for such encounters, running thousands of drills in desert and European terrain alike. Sensors scanned the approaching T-72s, calculating distances, angles, and weak points in real time. The main cannon tracked its targets with mechanical precision, ready to respond to any aggressive maneuver. The Abrams was not just surviving, it was preparing to dominate. Soviet commanders in the rear struggled to maintain control. Orders were shouted, radios crackled, but the psychological effect was immediate and brutal. Soldiers had been taught that no enemy could withstand a T-72's salvo at short to medium range. Yet here was a tank that defied that very principle. Confidence shattered into confusion. The narrative of invincibility, drilled into every Soviet tanker, crumbled in the face of an American technological marvel. In that tense silence, the first lesson of the Abrams became clear: Cold War dynamics were shifting. Tank battles would no longer be a matter of brute force alone. Survivability, speed, and advanced armor would redefine the battlefield. The Soviet crews had faced every type of NATO opposition and emerged victorious, but this was different. The M1 Abrams was not a tank in the traditional sense. It was a fortress on treads, a weapon designed to survive everything the Soviet Union could throw at it. As the T-72s regrouped for another attempt, the Abrams fired a single shot, a warning, precise, devastating. In simulation terms, this would have been enough to destroy the lead T-72. The result was immediate and unmistakable. Hesitation spread like wildfire. What had been aggressive confidence transformed into stunned inaction. Soviet tankers froze, staring at the monstrous silhouette of the M1, realizing that the battlefield had irrevocably changed. The morning exercise, intended to showcase Soviet dominance, became a psychological battlefield. Every commander, crew member, and observer understood that armored warfare doctrine would have to evolve. The M1 Abrams had done more than survive. It had shattered the myth of invincibility, rewriting the rules of engagement with a single, unyielding presence. The thunder of the T-72 cannons echoed across the open training grounds, each shell a testament to decades of Soviet armored ingenuity. These were not ordinary munitions. They were the pinnacle of Cold War engineering. APFSDS rounds, tungsten rods encased in steel sabot jackets, were capable of piercing nearly every NATO tank at ranges beyond 2 kilometers. Heat shells, with their focused explosive jets, could punch holes through multiple layers of steel and composite armor alike. The Soviet crews were confident. Decades of doctrine, drills, and battlefield simulations had trained them for one thing: victory against any Western armored vehicle. Yet, as the first salvo hit the M1 Abrams, disbelief replaced confidence. APFSDS rounds, traveling at hypersonic velocities, struck the tank's frontal glacis with a deafening clang. Sparks erupted, metal groaned, but no penetration occurred. The crew inside the T-72s could see it in real time through observation scopes and telemetry. The massive American tank remained unyielding, as though made of some impossible material. The Soviet commanders, initially dismissing the effect as luck, ordered repeated volleys. The tanks rotated, repositioned, adjusted elevation, and fired again. Every shot was meticulously calculated, every angle intended to exploit supposed weak points in the Abrams armor. Even the side shots, aimed at what intelligence reports claimed was a vulnerable seam near the turret ring, did nothing. The shells bounced, disintegrated, or failed to deform the layered Chobham armor. The reality was staggering. The Abrams composite armor was not just steel, it was a complex sandwich of ceramic tiles, reinforced with Kevlar and backed by explosive reactive armor in later models. This layered approach distributed kinetic energy across multiple surfaces, neutralizing the destructive force of incoming projectiles. Unlike traditional steel, which could shatter under repeated hits, the Abrams armor absorbed, redirected, and even deflected the impact. Soviet crews began to feel the creeping chill of panic. Drills had prepared them for tanks to take hits, for armor to fail, but nothing like this. T-72s that would normally send NATO tanks tumbling were now reduced to impotent firing platforms. Soldiers who had once sneered at American designs now found themselves whispering in disbelief, watching their most trusted weapons fail. One commander, a seasoned tank veteran who had served in exercises across the European theater, shouted into his radio, trying to rally the crews. "Concentrate fire! Target the sides! Use heat rounds!" But even the hollow charges, designed to focus molten metal jets into the heart of the tank, were largely ineffective. The Abrams layers absorbed the heat and pressure, preventing catastrophic penetration. Only minor superficial damage appeared: scratches, dents, and scorched paint. The M1 crew, meanwhile, had not fired a single shot yet. Their mission was to endure, to survive the initial engagement. Sensors tracked every approaching T-72, calculating impact trajectories, assessing incoming rounds, and relaying real-time data to the commander. The Abrams was built not just for raw firepower, but for endurance. Its systems allowed the crew to remain operational under bombardment that would destroy other tanks in seconds. As the salvo continued, Soviet observers recorded something remarkable: the psychological effect of failure. Tankers who had been confident, aggressive, and disciplined now hesitated. They fired in bursts, then paused, unsure of whether their weapons could do anything at all. Radios crackled with confusion, commands overlapped, and formations that were once precise now wavered. The battlefield was no longer a matter of firepower alone, it was a contest of morale. Attempts to flank the Abrams were met with another shock. The M1's mobility, powered by a turbine engine that could accelerate faster than the T-72 in short bursts, allowed it to reposition with surprising agility. The tank shifted slightly, forcing the Soviet crews to readjust their aim, throwing off their calculations. Every shot that missed, every second spent re-aiming, deepened the sense of frustration and disbelief. Meanwhile, telemetry and post-exercise analysis would later reveal why the Soviet shells failed so spectacularly. The APFSDS rounds, traveling at extreme velocity, relied on penetrating dense steel targets. Against layered composite armor, the energy dispersed across multiple materials, reducing the chance of complete penetration. Heat rounds, designed to focus explosive energy in a narrow cone, were blunted by the combination of ceramics and metal laminates. Even explosive reactive armor, designed to counteract these munitions, added another layer of unpredictability. The T-72's best efforts were literally meeting a wall engineered to absorb them. By the end of the exercise, Soviet commanders were forced to confront a bitter truth. Their elite crews, their advanced tanks, and their most sophisticated ammunition had failed to neutralize a single M1 Abrams. In practical terms, the exercise became a lesson in humility and fear. Across the observation points, senior officers shook their heads. The tanks had performed flawlessly under other conditions, but here, against American ingenuity and armor design, they were nearly impotent. The psychological impact was as significant as the technical one. Soldiers began to whisper among themselves, if these exercises reflected reality, what would happen in a real conflict? How could tactics that had dominated exercises for decades suddenly fail? The question echoed throughout the division. Confidence, once unshakable, had been replaced with doubt. As night fell, the M1 Abrams stood unscathed on the frozen training ground, a lone sentinel that had withstood the full fury of the Soviet armored corps. It was no longer just a tank, it was a symbol. The Americans had not only built a machine capable of surviving the T-72's deadliest ammunition, they had built a psychological weapon. Soviet tankers had frozen, not from fear of fire, but from the impossibility of overcoming it. This would be a turning point in armored warfare doctrine. No longer could massed fire alone guarantee victory. Technology, armor design, and survivability were rewriting the rules. The Cold War, often waged in intelligence reports, diplomatic threats, and proxy wars, had delivered its most vivid lesson yet on the training grounds of Europe. The Abrams was a game-changer, and the Soviet tank crews would never forget the day their best shells failed to destroy it. The winter sun dipped low over the training grounds, casting long shadows across the mud-slicked plains. The T-72 formations, once proud and confident, were now disorganized, staggered by disbelief. For hours, they had fired salvo after salvo at the M1 Abrams, yet every round had failed to pierce the American tank's defenses. Panic was seeping into the ranks. Even the most seasoned tank commanders, hardened by years of exercises and simulations, struggled to maintain composure. Inside the M1 Abrams, the crew moved with an almost surgical precision. Sensors tracked every T-72 as it maneuvered, calculating armor angles, shell trajectories, and distances. The main 120mm smoothbore cannon was a marvel of modern engineering, capable of firing high-velocity APFSDS rounds that could obliterate Soviet armor from ranges that made return fire nearly impossible. But the Abrams crew didn't rush. They had survived the opening salvo. Now it was time to assert dominance. The commander issued a calm order. Engage only high-value targets. Conserve fire, maintain position. The gunner adjusted the targeting system, a thermal and laser-guided array that could track multiple moving targets simultaneously. With a single breath, the Abrams became a predator on the plains. The T-72s, once the hunters, were about to become prey. The first counter-strike was devastating in its simplicity. A T-72, attempting to close distance while repositioning, came into the sights of the Abrams gun. The crew fired a single APFSDS round. In seconds, the tank's front glacis was obliterated, its turret mangled, its engine destroyed. The explosion was precise, surgical, and terrifyingly effective. There was no indiscriminate artillery barrage, just an exacting strike that eliminated one tank with almost effortless precision. Soviet crews scrambled, trying to understand how a single tank could produce such lethal efficiency. Some attempted flanking maneuvers, hoping to hit the Abrams from the sides or rear. The M1's mobility, powered by a turbine engine producing over 1,500 horsepower, allowed it to pivot and reposition faster than most T-72s could follow. Terrain that favored Soviet tanks, open fields for mass charges, was now an advantage for the Abrams' maneuverability. Every engagement reinforced the psychological collapse among the Soviet crews. Tanks that were once disciplined and coordinated now acted independently, firing sporadically, retreating haphazardly, or freezing entirely under the looming threat of the Abrams cannon. The American tank moved like a phantom, appearing where it was least expected, striking where the Soviet formations were weakest. Behind the scenes, Soviet commanders attempted to coordinate countermeasures. Smoke rounds were fired to obscure line of sight, heat shells were recalibrated, and flanking units tried to encircle the Abrams. Yet every tactic was anticipated by the Abrams' advanced targeting systems. The M1 could detect heat signatures through smoke, identify moving armor, and engage multiple targets with split-second precision. In effect, it had turned Soviet tactics against them. The contrast between Soviet expectation and reality could not have been starker. T-72 crews were trained to rely on mass firepower, numerical superiority, and aggressive maneuvers to overwhelm opponents. Against the Abrams, those principles failed. Numbers no longer mattered. Coordination was nearly irrelevant. Each T-72 faced a tank capable of neutralizing threats individually while surviving the collective assault of the entire formation. As the engagement progressed, reports from observers painted a surreal picture. The Abrams, with calculated movements, seemed almost invincible. Shell impacts that would have destroyed older tanks left it unscathed. Attempts at close-range engagement were met with precise retaliation. Even artillery support simulated in the exercise failed to inflict meaningful damage. For the first time, Soviet tank crews were experiencing the full effect of modern American armor technology. The M1's psychological impact was profound. Every destroyed or disabled T-72 sent ripples of fear through the remaining crews. Hesitation replaced aggression. Decisions that were once automatic, advance, fire, flank, now required conscious thought under immense pressure. Soldiers whispered in disbelief. "How can one tank do this?" Officers cursed under their breath, realizing that decades of Soviet armored doctrine were being rewritten in real time on the frozen plains. Meanwhile, the Abrams crew maintained composure, following standard operating procedures to perfection. They adjusted firing solutions, conserved ammunition, and exploited terrain. Every maneuver was a lesson in tactical efficiency. In contrast, the Soviet formations were fracturing, losing cohesion with each lost tank. By the end of the engagement, the Abrams had effectively neutralized multiple T-72s while sustaining negligible damage. The exercise concluded not with fanfare but with stunned silence. Observers noted the unprecedented survivability and lethality of the M1 Abrams. Soviet commanders convened to analyze what they had witnessed. Reports detailed the failures of APFSDS rounds, the inefficiency of heat shells against composite armor, and the unmatched tactical mobility of the American tank. The consensus was unanimous. The Abrams was not just a new tank, it was a revolution in armored warfare. For the Soviet crews, the day became a defining moment in their careers. Confidence had been shattered, doctrine challenged, and assumptions overturned. They had faced their best tanks, their finest shells, and found them powerless. Across the European theater, whispers began. If this was the reality, NATO had gained an edge that could not easily be countered. In the quiet aftermath, the Abrams rested atop a small rise, turrets scanning the horizon as if daring another challenge. It had survived, adapted, and struck with precision. It had turned the battlefield into a chessboard where only skill, technology, and composure dictated outcomes. The Soviet tankers had frozen, and the legend of the M1 Abrams had been cemented in the annals of armored warfare. The early morning mist clung to the frost-covered plains, painting the battlefield in an eerie silver. The T-72 crews were exhausted but determined. Hours of failed attacks had left them battered, frustrated, and bewildered. Their confidence was replaced with growing panic as the M1 Abrams, seemingly invincible, continued to dominate the field. For the Soviet tankers, what had begun as a training exercise was quickly morphing into a brutal lesson in futility and terror. Commanders attempted to regroup the scattered formations. Radio chatter crackled with urgent, almost frantic orders. Reform the left flank. Concentrate fire on the rear sector. Don't give it a chance to maneuver. Yet execution faltered at every step. The Abrams had already forced the T-72s into a reactive posture. Its combination of speed, firepower, and armor made every Soviet movement perilous. A single misstep could leave a tank destroyed, a crew decimated, or a formation broken beyond repair. Soviet tankers tried everything. Small teams attempted flanking maneuvers to strike the Abrams from angles they believed vulnerable. Coordinated volleys were planned to overwhelm the M1 with sheer numbers, relying on doctrine that emphasized massed firepower. Yet every tactic was countered effortlessly. The Abrams shifted positions with uncanny agility, its turbine engine enabling rapid acceleration and precise navigation across terrain that would have bogged down T-72s. It avoided crossfire, selected the weakest attackers, and struck with pinpoint accuracy. One particularly bold T-72 commander attempted a daring close-range maneuver, hoping to use the tank's speed and low profile to breach the Abrams' defenses. The Soviet crew lunged forward, engines roaring, but before they could close the distance, a single shot from the M1's cannon obliterated their frontal armor. Flames erupted from the engine compartment, the turret twisted grotesquely, and the tank was effectively removed from the engagement. Observers noted the surgical precision, not a wasted round, not a miscalculation. The Abrams had turned a desperate offensive into an opportunity to destroy its opponent efficiently. Panic spread like wildfire. Tankers hesitated before firing, second-guessing every action. Some froze entirely, unable to process the speed and lethality of the American tank. Even commanders struggled to issue coherent orders as formations fractured. Small units attempted to cover one another, but each move seemed anticipated, countered, or rendered irrelevant. The battlefield had shifted from one of strategy and training to one dominated by fear and unpredictability. Behind the lines, Soviet engineers and tacticians scrambled to understand the phenomenon. Reports analyzed the M1's armor composition, mobility, and targeting systems. The findings were alarming. The Abrams Chobham armor was a layered marvel of steel, ceramics, and Kevlar, designed specifically to absorb and deflect both kinetic and chemical energy rounds. Its main cannon, capable of firing armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds at velocities exceeding 1,500 meters per second, could neutralize a T-72 before it ever closed to effective range. And the turbine engine allowed unprecedented maneuverability for a tank of its size, giving it the ability to outpace, outflank, and reposition with devastating efficiency. In real time, Soviet crews faced an impossible dilemma. Traditional tactics, mass frontal assaults, coordinated volleys, and aggressive flanking were no longer sufficient. Each approach was met with deadly precision. Every mistake was punished instantly. The Abrams did not merely defend itself, it dictated the tempo and direction of the battle, forcing opponents into reactive, disorganized actions. The psychological toll was immense. Veteran tankers, men who had faced live-fire exercises and NATO maneuvers for years without fear, now hesitated before taking any action. Radios were filled with confusion, reports of failed shots, destroyed tanks, and tactical uncertainty. Officers struggled to maintain morale, shouting orders that were drowned out by the deafening sound of turbines, shells, and exploding armor. What had been a demonstration of Soviet armored prowess had devolved into a battlefield dominated by panic. Meanwhile, the Abrams crew remained methodical. Every movement was calculated, every shot deliberate. It exploited terrain, used hold-down positions to minimize exposure, and leveraged its superior sensors to track Soviet maneuvers even through smoke and snow. The American tank had become both a hammer and a shield, striking opponents with lethal precision while remaining almost impervious to return fire. The Soviets tried one last desperate tactic, a coordinated double flank. Two groups of T-72s would converge from opposite directions, forcing the Abrams to split attention and fire on multiple targets. For a fleeting moment, it seemed plausible. The two flanks moved in synchronized timing, guns elevated and ready to fire. But the Abrams anticipated the maneuver. Using rapid lateral movement and its fire control systems, it engaged the lead tank from one flank, destroying it before the second wave could effectively react. The remaining T-72s hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Their plan, though audacious, had been neutralized with a single tank acting decisively. By the end of the exercise, Soviet commanders and observers were forced to confront a stark truth. The M1 Abrams had rewritten the rules of armored warfare. It wasn't simply a tank, it was a paradigm shift. Its combination of firepower, mobility, and defensive armor had exposed the limitations of even the most advanced Soviet designs. The once confident tank crews had frozen under the pressure, their doctrine rendered nearly obsolete in the presence of superior technology. That night, the plains were silent, but the echoes of defeat lingered. Reports circulated throughout Soviet divisions, detailing the devastating efficiency of the Abrams. Engineers, tacticians, and soldiers alike understood that a single M1 had not just survived, they had dominated. And in the cold, shadowed fields of the exercise ground, Soviet tankers quietly acknowledged what they had witnessed. The era of invincible T-72s was over. Against the M1 Abrams, confidence, experience, and doctrine alone were no longer enough. The bitter wind whipped across the European plains, carrying with it the smell of burned diesel and scorched metal. The Soviet 3rd Guards Tank Division, once a disciplined and feared unit, had descended into chaos. Their formations were fractured, radios filled with static, and tankers moved like shadows of themselves, hesitant and uncertain. What had begun as a confident exercise to demonstrate Soviet armored superiority had become a stark lesson in vulnerability. The M1 Abrams had proven not only resilient, but overwhelmingly dominant, forcing an entire division to rethink every principle of armored warfare. Soviet crews now faced more than physical destruction. They were contending with a profound psychological shock. The M1 Abrams had not merely survived their best ammunition, it had absorbed it, anticipated their maneuvers, and retaliated with surgical precision. Veteran tankers, men who had spent years mastering the T-72's systems and tactics, froze before the silhouette of the American tank. Some did not even fire, their hands trembling as they adjusted targeting sights they no longer trusted. Others attempted attacks that were instantly neutralized, reinforcing the feeling of futility. The Abrams, meanwhile, operated like a predator. Its targeting computer tracked multiple T-72s simultaneously, calculating angles, velocity, and armor weaknesses in real time. A single shot destroyed the lead tank of a charging group, the next obliterated a flanker attempting to circle behind. Each movement of the Abrams was deliberate, a masterclass in armored combat efficiency. To the Soviet crews, it appeared almost supernatural, a machine that could see the battlefield in a way no human could match. The effect on morale was instantaneous. Hesitation replaced aggression, and hesitation in armored warfare is fatal. T-72 crews, trained to react quickly and decisively, found themselves frozen mid-maneuver, unsure of whether to advance, retreat, or fire. Commands that were once executed instinctively now required conscious thought under extreme pressure. Errors multiplied, formations collapsed, and the chain of command strained under the weight of unexpected defeat. In an attempt to regain initiative, Soviet officers attempted a coordinated counterattack using all remaining tanks. 2 platoons were ordered to advance from multiple directions, creating overlapping fields of fire to overwhelm the Abrams. For a brief moment, hope flickered. The tankers adjusted speed, rotated turrets, and prepared their guns. But the M1, with its advanced fire control system, had already predicted their moves. Its main cannon struck the first target from a distance, while thermal imaging allowed it to track the second as it attempted to maneuver through cover. Explosions tore through engines and turrets alike. The counterattack collapsed before it could achieve any meaningful effect. The psychological toll deepened further with every destroyed or disabled T-72. Survivors reported the precision and lethality of the Abrams with disbelief. One crew member whispered into the radio, almost inaudibly, It sees everything. It knows where we'll be before we move." Such comments were repeated across the battlefield. The M1 Abrams had become more than a machine. It was a symbol of technological superiority, a living testament to the growing disparity between NATO and Soviet armor at the time. As the afternoon wore on, Soviet tankers began to abandon aggressive tactics entirely. Fires erupted in T-72 engines, tracks were shredded, and communication lines were overwhelmed. The division commander, a man who had trained in exercises across Eastern Europe, realized the depth of the problem. Doctrine alone could not overcome this machine. The tactics that had dominated armored engagements for decades, mass frontal assaults, coordinated flanking, and concentrated firepower, were obsolete when faced with the Abrams' combination of armor, firepower, and mobility. Even attempts to create distractions, smoke screens, feints, and decoy targets failed to change the outcome. The M1 could detect heat signatures through smoke and adjust its position accordingly. Every movement of the Soviet tanks seemed anticipated, countered, and exploited. The Abrams had turned the battlefield into a chessboard where every Soviet pawn was vulnerable, and the single American queen controlled the flow of combat. Reports from observers and engineers circulated rapidly after the exercise. They highlighted the incredible survivability of the Abrams under sustained fire, the lethal efficiency of its 120mm cannon, and the psychological impact of facing an opponent that seemed invincible. Analysts noted that even highly trained crews were paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, illustrating that the Abrams' advantages extended beyond technology into the realm of morale and battlefield psychology. By evening, the battlefield was littered with damaged T-72s and the echoes of a lesson that could not be ignored. The Abrams remained intact, turrets scanning the horizon, sensors alert, engine humming like a predator ready for the next hunt. The Soviet tankers had not just been defeated, they had been psychologically broken. Confidence was shattered, tactical initiative lost, and the very principles that had governed armored warfare for decades were called into question. In the quiet aftermath, Soviet commanders convened to assess the damage, not just material, but doctrinal. They realized that any engagement with M1 Abrams tanks in a real conflict could lead to catastrophic losses. The exercise became a case study in the lethal combination of technological superiority, battlefield awareness, and psychological dominance. The M1 Abrams had done more than survive, it had rewritten the rules of engagement. It had demonstrated that even the most elite tank crews, armed with the most sophisticated shells, could be rendered ineffective by superior engineering and tactics. For the Soviet tankers, the memory of that day, the shells that failed, the precision strikes, and the relentless dominance, would haunt them for the rest of their careers. By nightfall, the lessons were clear. The Abrams was more than a weapon, it was a statement. In the tense arena of the Cold War, technology, speed, and armor were the new currency of survival. The Soviet tankers had frozen under fire, and the legend of the M1 Abrams as an unstoppable armored force had been cemented for generations of soldiers to come. The European plains were silent under the cold dusk sky, except for the faint hum of the Abrams turbine engine. What remained of the Soviet T-72 formations huddled in scattered positions, engines smoldering and turrets twisted, their crews shaken, exhausted, and humiliated. The once proud 3rd Guards Tank Division had been tested to its limits and found wanting. Their doctrine, honed over decades and considered near infallible, had been shattered by a single American main battle tank. The M1 Abrams had survived volleys that would have destroyed entire armored brigades, and now it stood as the undisputed master of the battlefield. Inside the Abrams, the crew maintained their calm, almost eerily serene. Sensors scanned the horizon for remaining threats, targeting systems locked on potential danger, and the main cannon remained ready. The crew had executed the engagement with precision and patience, fully aware that the exercise was both a test of technology and a demonstration of battlefield dominance. Every maneuver, every shot, had reinforced the lessons that would reverberate far beyond the training grounds. The Soviet command structure convened a post-exercise analysis that evening, a meeting heavy with frustration, disbelief, and grudging respect. The findings were unequivocal. The Abrams had not only survived repeated direct hits from the best Soviet APFSDS and heat rounds but had also neutralized opposing T-72s with unparalleled efficiency. Officers acknowledged a stark reality: numerical superiority and decades of armored doctrine were meaningless when faced with a tank that combined advanced armor, firepower, mobility, and sensor technology. The psychological impact on the Soviet tankers could not be overstated. Men who had prided themselves on their skill, their tanks, and their training were left to confront an uncomfortable truth: confidence alone could not overcome technological superiority. Some crews whispered about the Abrams' seeming invincibility, describing it as if it possessed an almost supernatural battlefield awareness. For the first time, tankers were forced to accept that engineering could trump experience, and strategy might falter against raw technological advantage. Military analysts began to study the encounter in exhaustive detail. They noted the Abrams Chobham composite armor, a multilayered defense that absorbed kinetic energy and explosive impacts more effectively than any steel or reactive armor previously fielded by NATO or the Soviet Union. They marveled at the 120mm smoothbore cannon, capable of firing APFSDS rounds with extreme precision, often destroying targets before they could even effectively return fire. And the turbine engine, delivering unprecedented acceleration and mobility for a vehicle of its weight, allowed the Abrams to dictate the tempo of engagements, forcing opponents into reactive, vulnerable positions. The lessons were clear. Soviet armored warfare doctrine required fundamental reevaluation. Mass frontal assaults, concentrated volleys, and traditional flanking maneuvers were no longer guaranteed paths to victory. A single M1 Abrams could turn the battlefield into a nightmare for formations trained to dominate through coordination and firepower. The implications for real-world engagements were staggering. Any encounter with Abrams tanks could result in catastrophic losses if tactics and technology were not updated to counter them. As word of the exercise spread, the Abrams began to gain legendary status, both within NATO circles and among Soviet strategists. It became a symbol of American engineering prowess and Cold War technological superiority. Soviet commanders, who had once taken pride in their tank crews' abilities, were forced to admit that their best soldiers could be rendered ineffective against a single, well-designed platform. Reports circulated describing the M1 not just as a tank, but as a psychological weapon capable of instilling fear, hesitation, and disarray in even the most elite armored units. For the American military, the engagement validated years of research and investment. The Abrams had been designed to survive the full spectrum of modern armored threats, and the exercise proved its combat effectiveness beyond simulations. Its combination of armor, firepower, and mobility was unmatched, capable of reshaping armored doctrine and providing NATO forces with a decisive advantage in any potential European theater engagement. In the aftermath, Soviet tankers reflected quietly on the day's events. Veterans who had once laughed at NATO tanks now recounted stories of their own paralysis, describing how their best shells bounced off the M1, how precise strikes eliminated their comrades, and how one machine had frozen an entire division with its presence alone. The exercise was seared into memory, not merely as a demonstration of the Abrams' power, but as a turning point in armored warfare. By nightfall, the training grounds were silent. The M1 Abrams rested atop a small rise, turrets scanning the horizon, sensors alert, engines quiet but ready. It had endured, struck with precision, and dominated with efficiency. The legend was born: a single tank, capable of surviving the best that Soviet armor could deliver, had rewritten the rules of the battlefield. It had turned theory into reality, intimidation into awe, and technological innovation into strategic supremacy. For the Soviet forces, the message was unambiguous. The era of unquestioned armored dominance was over. Doctrine would need to evolve, tactics would need to adapt, and engineers would be forced to innovate at unprecedented speed. But for that moment, all they could do was acknowledge the undeniable truth: the M1 Abrams was more than a tank. It was a weapon, a fortress, and a psychological force that had frozen the best of Soviet tank crews in disbelief, and it had done so with terrifying, undeniable perfection.